Senator Andy Manar, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. You've been one of the main architects looking at education funding and some of the disparities around the state of Illinois in the way we fund education. Given where we are here, no budget for 2 years, the grand bargain seems to be derailed. What can you tell us of what you're working on now relative to education funding?
Well, we have a bill that was negotiated with the Republican caucus in the Senate last week. It hasn't been filed yet, but it's representative of the governor's commission's work. And I think it's a bill that eventually could get significant bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. We haven't filed that bill to date because of the governor's actions last week. As you know, we took several votes on Tuesday as part of the grand bargain in the Senate. Those were passed with bipartisan support. And we came to session the next day on Wednesday, and something had changed dramatically, and Republicans removed their support pursuant to Governor Rauner's direction for provisions in the grand bargain. And that includes, unfortunately, what was a fully negotiated school funding bill. So that bill still exists. It's ready to be voted on. We're just waiting for the governor to give the Republicans permission to vote for the bill.
And so Senator Collerton, the Senate president, held the bills back because he said there's no point in bringing them to the floor to have them defeated. Are you hopeful that, based on what you just said, are you hopeful that something's going to be worked out to where those bills could be brought up and the Republican members may vote for it? And have you heard them come back and say, we just need a tweaking of it, which Democratic members were saying they were tweaking, and it seemed like a moving target, and you and some of your colleagues were frustrated by that what you thought was a deal, as you just said, fell apart. So where do we stand on that? Have you heard from talking to any of your Republican colleagues? Are they close to agreeing to something so that we can get a funding bill on education?
Well, we haven't heard today. That process was abruptly ended last week. Many of us who have worked very long on many of these bills were, I would just say it was probably the most frustrating day I've had on this job in a couple of years. Because when you look at the school funding bill, it's so many people that have put so much work and time, both sides of the aisle, into that bill. And to get it to a point to where we were ready to take a vote and have, think about this, a bipartisan solution to a decades-old problem in Illinois, only to have Governor Rauner, drop in at the 11th hour and say, not good enough. That's not about the school funding bill, right? That's about larger politics in the state. We haven't heard much from our colleagues this week in the Senate, and I would suspect that's because the governor hasn't relinquished his position and literally given the Republican members of the Senate permission to vote for bills that they wrote and bills that they negotiated. And until that changes, unfortunately, the work that we did in a bipartisan way, and President Collerton, our Democratic leader, and Leader Radonio on the Republican side, they should be given a lot of credit for their leadership. But until the governor changes...
Radonio was voting for the bills, right?
She was, yeah.
For those who don't know, she is the Republican leader in the Senate. So you had her working with the Democratic leader in the Senate in a good faith. I think they would both say there were things they both hated in the bill and both things they would like in the bill, which is why it was the grand bargain. Right?
And Terry, she said in her closing remarks for the session session last week on the Senate floor that that she used the phrase she still wanted to land the plane, and I compliment her for her continued leadership. But the problem is none of her colleagues in her own caucus were on the plane anymore because the governor told them to get off. And until that dynamic changes and until the governor allows the Senate to legislate without threats, without political consequences for members in his own caucus, we're going to be at a stalemate, which we should remind ourselves. Every day that goes by, we dig ourselves $11 million dollars deeper into debt on the backs of taxpayers in the state. And by the time the 2018 election rolls around, which for some people in this building is some type of a benchmark for the future, which is nonsense in my mind, the state will be sitting on $24 billion worth of unpaid bills, on Election Day in 2018. That is unthinkable. That is a mountain that I don't have the words today to describe how we're going to get over and fix. That's almost the entire general fund budget in 1 year's time. And there's people today that think that that's acceptable, and we saw that in action last week in the Senate when the governor, stopped any effort to pass this grand bargain.
And you don't know what was the nature of his complaint?
I don't, with all due respect to him, we don't do a whole lot of talking to Governor Rauner. And what we've tried to do in the Senate is work with the members of the Senate, absent of the House, absent of Governor Rauner, come up with a bipartisan agreement to be the catalyst to wrestle loose this logjam that has plagued our state for 2 years. That was the goal. And the reason why it was successful on Tuesday was because the governor didn't weigh in. But then when he did weigh in on Wednesday, it fell apart in a hurry. And that's why we're back to square one today, unfortunately.
So before we let you go, had you had the votes, what would that bill have done for education funding?
Yeah, that's a good question. Nobody's asked me that so far. So it would have embraced the governor's own commission, which I was one of 25 members. Dr. Beth Purvis, who's the governor's education secretary, led the commission, did a great job. We had 75 hours worth of hearings, and we came up with a model that would say, first, we should devote new money to districts with the highest rates of poverty and the highest needs. We should hold districts harmless. So, in other words, we should stop one system, not reduce it, but just stop one system, freeze it, and then we ought to turn another system on so that we can begin to take this turn toward greater equity in the state. That was the number one suggestion of the commission. And if we could only do that, we'll be worlds ahead of where we are today.
Would we be changing at least changing some of the funding from the schools to where they're not reliant so much on the property tax and more to a general tax?
Yeah, and we would start first with districts that have the highest tax rates in the state. So those also happen to be the districts that suffer the most under inequity, which is opposite of what most people in the state think. The districts with the highest tax rate have the least amount of money to spend because there's just no, there's no...
It's not enough economic base right?
to tax. So they're forced to continue to raise their taxes. So the bill would ease pressure on those taxpayers. And then the other thing it would do, which is a long-term goal, is it would lessen the burden on property taxes by making sure that the state fulfills its obligation. Now, that's not going to happen overnight, but it will begin to turn the tide. And again, I want to reemphasize, that was a bipartisan approach in the commission that was embraced in our negotiations with Senator Barrickman, who led the negotiations on behalf of the Senate Republican caucus, should be commended for his work. But when the governor comes in at the 11th hour and says, stop what you're doing, that's going to have an impact. And it had a severe impact last week. We could be standing here today with all of these things done out of the Senate today. Senate could have passed a bipartisan education funding bill for the first time in decades that I think would have a substantial chance in the House and being signed by Governor Rauner. But because of his actions, we're not there this week.
Well, and for people who don't follow legislative gamesmanship, for lack of a better word, the House wasn't in last week. Yeah. Some of these votes are going to be difficult votes to vote for. You could be hurt politically. And so there is that quandary if you're in the Senate. If I vote for this, the House might not even take it up. Do you have reason to believe, I'm asking you to speculate, I guess, would the House take these up if they get out of the Senate?
I would have no basis of saying one way or the other. I will say this, though. The time for gaming this politically is over. We could come up with 20 different political consequences or even more to what would happen if we take difficult votes in the Senate on bills that we typically wouldn't support. But the time for that's over. We are in a full-blown crisis in the state of Illinois today. It's financial in nature, and we have to attack that. And that's what we're doing this week in the Senate. Regardless of political consequences, we're trying to show leadership to make sure that we have a plan to have a balanced and sustainable budget. The time for politics is in the rearview mirror. We have to look forward. We got to solve this problem.
Okay, so one last question. I appreciate your time. As we stand here on March the 7th, come April, a few weeks away, school districts are going to have to be informing teachers if they're going to be renewing their contract for the fall. They make all kinds of economic assessments and judgments in the spring. So I'm asking you again to guess where we are today, as you have the finger on the pulse of what's going on in the legislature. Are we going to have education funding as it has been for the last 2 years, where at least that part has been funded? Or might we head into a period of time where not even K-12 education is going to be funded in the new fiscal year?
That's a question that should be posed to Governor Rauner. It's clear that the Senate is going to act, as we did last year, to lead the effort to make sure schools are funded. But we also have to understand, and we just talked about this with Dr. Tony Smith, who's the superintendent of schools, in the Education Committee a few minutes ago, that we can make all the promises in the world to school districts, as we did this year, with a full year's budget, only agency in state government that was fully appropriated. But appropriation is only authorization to spend. If we don't have the revenue to back it up, if we don't have a way to pay for it, we are making absolutely, completely empty promises to school districts, which impact the poorest districts in the state. So it was a bipartisan effort to fund schools last year. But you know, there's $1.15 billion worth of bills owed to school districts, the poorest school districts in the state, that are sitting at the comptroller's office today. That's going to continue to go up if we don't have that as part of a balanced framework in a complete budget. That's our goal in the Senate. We can't continue to promise things to schools and not pay for them. That's a campaign tactic. That's not real. And it isn't realized on a local basis every day when school boards and superintendents make their decisions. So I just asked Dr. Smith in the committee hearing, are we going to make more empty promises to school districts and appropriate a whole bunch of money and not actually pay for it? Or are we going to actually get down to business and solve this budget crisis? And had Governor Rauner not stepped in last week, we would have the answer to that question today. But unfortunately, he did step in. And so today we're left with no fewer answers than we had before.
Senator Andy Manar, thank you.
Thank you.